United States will host 49 African heads of states and the African Union envoy in Washington for a three-day U.S. Africa summit. That's between 13 to 15 December. It's the second such summit under U.S. President Joe Biden's administration. Mali, Burkina Faso, Sudan and Guinea are the only African countries not invited to the summit. They are serving suspensions because of coups. Zimbabwe, which was snubbed last year, was invited to the summit, but President Emerson Mnangagwa is unable to attend because of travel restrictions. Instead, Foreign Affairs Minister Frederick Shava, former envoy to the UN in Washington, will make the trip. International relations expert Professor John Stremlau is joining us for some insights on this. A very good evening to you, Professor Stremlau. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So a headline read, Biden's Africa Summit has democracy on the agenda, but not the invite list. Autocrats among those invited to the summit in Washington. What is your reaction to this one?
Well, look, this is an imperfect world, and so consequently, you have to make trade-offs. And I think that at this moment in time, it's a very good step to have the African summit occur. And I know that some critics in Washington have noted that the president of Ethiopia is coming, Abiy, and yet South Africa brokered for a peace agreement in Ethiopian conflict. And El-Sisi in Egypt is another controversial figure, but he's just hosted COP27, which was an important development for Africa. And South Sudan is South Sudan, and Salva Kiir is coming. And so there are lots of questions, but ultimately, it's important for Africans to meet with the Biden administration, particularly after the Trump administration, which was hostile to Africa and racist domestically. You have people like Ebong, who is a woman of great distinction, a lawyer, who runs the U.S. Trade and Development Corporation, and she'll be there. And there's Adeyemo, who is the Deputy Secretary of Treasury. It's a reminder that the African diaspora is critical to American democracy, and it is incumbent upon Africans to engage, but to do so, if they can, with one voice. I would note that the concern that Africans had with the maligned Russian Activities Act has been mooted. It is pushed to the side. Biden has assured Ramaphosa that this would not see the light of day, and it hasn't. It's caught up in the Senate, and it did pass the House of Representatives, but it's going nowhere. So I think there's room for constructive work. But the agenda ought to be economic. It ought to be climate and sustainability, which is where the U.S. has made pledges. Biden has rejoined the climate conference, and I think it's in Africans' interest that they have a democratic administration in Washington. This is domestic politics. It's a good reminder that Africa can engage and work with the Americans as long as they also work with the Chinese and others. And differences over Ukraine will not feature on this agenda.
And I think this is what I want to speak about, Professor Stremlau. This U.S. Africa summit taking place on American home turf. You were speaking about wiggle room. How far does the reset button go when one is talking about these increased geopolitical tensions with Russia, relations with China, and how they impact on Africa per se? How far deep does that reset button go, and how big or wide is that wiggle room if it happens on American home turf?
The reset button that you speak of, I don't think of in global terms. I think of it in local domestic terms, because America is in a constitutional crisis, not unlike the one that is facing the African National Congress in South Africa by extension. And it has gone through a period of high polarization. The midterm elections last week were very encouraging. It's important for Africans who support overwhelmingly, that is the African American community, 85% support the Democrats and Joe Biden. This is not an opportunity for raking over geopolitical issues, but an opportunity to talk practical agendas of the renewal of AGOA, of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and the Treasury Department doing constructive things for Africa in public health, vaccines for pandemics, all sorts of practical issues, and mitigating the effects of climate change and mitigating the effects of the Ukraine war, which as Martin Kimani, the ambassador to the UN from Kenya, rightly pointed out, is an assault on the fundamentals that have been the bedrock of African international and regional order. That is to say, sovereign equality and territorial integrity. But we are also in an age where domestic politics matter. And it does matter to Africa to have a democratic administration in Washington. So this is a good opportunity to at least engage, but not to genuflect or be other than proud Africans that are meeting on equal footing with Joe Biden and his administration. And I think that will be to everyone's credit.
And in terms of how the United States sees these African countries, particularly those who are seen as in good standing with the African Union, which is the primary political bloc overseeing the continent, would President Joe Biden be in support for a call for the AU to be a member of the G20, because this is something that has been raised by the African bloc?
No, I think they're certainly going to be receptive to that idea. But don't forget that the Constitutive Act, for Africa's own good reasons, emphasizes democratic accountability. Most of the African conflicts are within states, not between or among states. And the principle of non-indifference about the internal affairs of member states, the fact that the African Charter for Democracy, Elections, and Governance stipulates that all states should have constitutional transfers of power, not military coups. The three that are not invited are coup countries, and that's consistent with the African Union. At a time when Joe Biden is promoting democracy internationally, it doesn't mean that the African countries have to respond to that, but for their own self-interests, it is incumbent on Africa to have a world where raw power is not exercised, but conciliation and diplomacy prevail. And I think that they can go into this meeting behind the African Union and calling for all countries to respect the values of the Constitutive Act and the African Charter, and to support the African Free Trade Area. That means if the Chinese want to work in Africa, they shouldn't mess around with the African domestic affairs, but neither should the Americans or neither should the Russians. But they should at least be open to Africa choosing democratic options rather than autocratic options for the good of Africa.